Digital games are receiving increasing attention in geography and digital humanities as a field of study more broadly. But when we hear about digital games in research contexts, it predominantly seems to be from a consumer perspective, from playing them. But finished published games typically hide a lot of the labour that went into producing them, often involving highly iterative processes of conceptualization, design, testing, and reworking, in which spatial processes are implicated many times over. This might be in practices of moulding the work to suit the aims and aesthetics of a project, analysing how people interact with what you've made, and of particular interest to geographers, attempting to manipulate forms of spatio-temporal attunement to generate positively affective experiences for players, as James Ash has illuminated in his research on video game testing. My research has been looking at location-based games, those in which a player's location is central to the progression of the gameplay, to understand their potential for telling the stories that make places meaningful for us. This has involved designing and making location-based games myself for a public audience, recording and reflecting on these highly iterative processes of production, and observing and interviewing participants in what I've made. While I don't have an extensive background in game design, I was able to make use of some accessible tools that are used widely for other location-based games, such as social media platforms and technologies like QR codes, which don't require, for example, knowledge of programming. While what you can make and therefore study will be limited by expertise, opportunities for collaboration and/or training, availability of hardware and software, as well as time and funding, you can use some of these limitations to study the affordances of whichever tools you do choose to use, and the production processes that you take part in. In my case, in studying the relationship between navigation and narrative in location-based games, my research has been approaching navigation as a form of attunement between different forms of spatial information and the affordances of platforms through which this information is encountered. In the case of my latest game, as this quote from a participant shows, this has involved players engaging with place using tools such as Google Street View, What3Words, and search engines. As players negotiate the gameplay rules and content, and the affordances of these platforms used to encounter it, I've found that location-based games can be designed to re-enchant relationships with place by using these tools to reveal some of the affective potential that exists alongside the everyday. Players can develop critical forms of awareness towards their surroundings through the meaningful inefficiencies this digitally mediated play provokes, and also employ creative practices to re-evaluate what these places mean to them. Yet these processes of attunement will also be conditioned by barriers to access. As a designer, you need to carefully consider which platforms you use, the ways information is organized on these platforms, which places the game can take place in, and which kinds of people may be excluded by the practices involved. Other considerations include the ethics around how personal information is shared and stored securely in digital settings, as well as the individualistic design of digital devices and platforms more generally, which can limit the forms of community-oriented spatial practice that the game provokes. By addressing my research questions as a design brief, and one that requires numerous cycles of planning, testing, evaluating, and revising, I've been able to encounter these varied possibilities and challenges of location-based games in practice many times over, learning both the impact that subtle, small-scale factors can have on people's experiences of place, and the creative techniques designers can also use to negotiate these. Yet the effects these tacit, mundane, or taken for granted factors can have are often not apparent when studying finished, polished games. I want to emphasize that by only looking at the finished product, you're only able to encounter a fraction of the ways in which space is implicated in the development of digital games and the experiences of those who play them. I therefore really encourage geographers to take part in practices of game design going forward as a way of studying these media and understanding their implications for space and place.